She entered as though her body had carried the weight of silence for years, not with the urgency of someone seeking absolution, nor the hesitancy of the unsure. She moved like a woman who had already said everything, just not aloud. The coat she wore was heavy, moss green, frayed slightly at the cuffs. Her hands, thin and pale, clutched a folded piece of paper that she never offered. She never needed to. He'd seen it before, this kind of grief that aged before its time. But what struck him wasn't the sadness, it was the restraint. She didn't sit like a woman collapsing. She sat like someone holding herself together out of spite. Her voice, when it came, was quiet, measured. She didn't stammer, didn't pause. What she said arrived already digested, already suffered through. He didn't interrupt, not even when the silence stretched between her words like fog between trees. She had been married for 7 years. The early days, she said, had not been bad. Not great, not euphoric, but stable. They both had careers, a house, dinners, shared calendars. She learned his preferences, his moods, how he liked his tea. Then, something inside her began to wither. It began with the fatigue, a constant, unrelenting heaviness. She thought it was stress, then anemia. It wasn't. The diagnosis came softly and cruelly, an autoimmune illness that would weaken her over time. She told him gently. He responded with concern, gestures, the right words. But something subtle changed. He didn't say it, but he started looking past her. She noticed it in the way he stood near the kitchen counter. His body turned slightly away. She felt it when he touched her shoulder but no longer lingered. And she heard it, most painfully, in what he didn't say when she came home from the hospital. She said he didn't complain, didn't lash out. But slowly, methodically, he vanished from the space between them. No more shared cups of tea, no more absent-minded shoulder squeezes. He was there, but only in shadow. She learned not to ask, because when she did, his eyes darkened. He never shouted, but there was something sharper than yelling in his quiet dismissals. Eventually, she stopped initiating conversations altogether, and then came the late nights. He began working more, coming home later, forgetting small things, her medications, her favorite yogurt, to check the heater. She said she never confronted him, not because she didn't suspect, but because her body was too tired to hold one more burden. She described the woman in cold, clinical terms. Mid-30s, curly hair, worked in his building. She knew this not because he confessed, but because she'd once answered a call when his phone buzzed in the night. The screen read, "Natalie Office," and the voice on the other end paused when she said hello. She didn't bring it up. Not that night. Not ever. Instead, she folded it into herself, just like he had folded his absence into their home. The real cruelty, she said, wasn't the affair itself. It was how well he managed it, how carefully he compartmentalized guilt. He didn't stop being polite. He didn't become cruel. He simply became a man with 2 lives and made her a ghost in both. She recalled moments with chilling clarity. A night she fainted in the bathroom and woke alone. He'd slept through it, or chosen to. A morning he forgot her birthday, and then brought flowers the next day, as if flowers had memory. Still, she didn't leave. Why? She didn't say it directly, but in the way she recounted brushing her teeth alone each night, standing in the mirror watching herself fade, he understood. She had hoped somehow that staying would make her visible again, that if she just waited long enough, the man she married would remember her. But what she got instead was erasure. By year 6, she had stopped hoping. And then, she said this as if talking about someone else, she filed for separation. He didn't fight it, didn't cry, didn't even ask why. He signed the papers the day they arrived, and just like that, she said, he was free. Free to live openly what he had already been living in secret. She moved into a smaller flat, nearer to the hospital. She found a rhythm again, slow, quiet, but hers, until one day she heard. The woman, Natalie, had emptied his savings account and left. No note, no warning. He had come home to find his clothes slashed, his accounts drained, and the quiet finally turned on him. The news didn't bring her joy, it brought relief. Not because he was punished, but because it wasn't her job anymore to carry the weight of him. She sat in front of me, hands folded neatly, as though recounting someone else's story. Only her eyes betrayed her. They were not eyes of revenge. They were eyes of release. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just said, very softly, "Some people only recognize pain when they lose the audience they inflicted it on." And I believed her, because sometimes the quietest ones carry the deepest wounds, and still they come forward, not for justice, not for sympathy, but to let go, to name what hurt them, and finally, to let it stop. He learned early that the worst betrayals are never loud. They don't come with slammed doors or tearful apologies. They arrive quietly, on tiptoes, then take everything while you're looking the other way. That's what her story felt like. She told me more about the illness, how at first it was just a nuisance, tiredness, dizzy spells, bruises that lingered. Then, slowly, it began to take her life away in inches. She started missing work. Doctors filled her days with blood tests and consultations. The couch became her prison. And worst of all, her independence shrank. She had once been someone people relied on. Now she relied on everyone else. And he, her husband, didn't know how to sit in her suffering. She never blamed him aloud, but she painted the picture with precision. He grew quieter, not in mourning, but in evasion, as if being near her body reminded him of something he couldn't fix and didn't want to witness. She described their home like a museum of what used to be a marriage. They passed each other like cautious guests at an art exhibit neither of them cared for anymore. He began staying out longer. "Work drinks," he'd say. Then later, he stopped offering reasons altogether. She knew about Natalie before she ever saw her. It was in the tone of his voice when he spoke to someone on the phone outside the room. It was in the new shirt he bought, the way he began using cologne again. And perhaps, most painfully, it was in how gently he treated her. Yes, gently. Because guilt changes a man's cruelty. He doesn't yell. He lowers his voice. He doesn't strike. He withdraws affection like punishment wrapped in pity. She remembered how he began asking, "Are you okay?" but didn't wait for the answer. How he bought groceries but forgot her medication. How he brought her books she didn't ask for, but stopped sitting beside her while she read them. Natalie became a certainty the day he came home smelling of someone else. Not perfume, shame. She didn't scream. She didn't confront him. Instead, she folded the duvet over herself and stared at the ceiling for hours. The following morning, he brought her breakfast. French toast, strawberries, tea with too much sugar. She ate every bite. Not because she forgave him, but because that was the last time he would ever do something that tender. Then the lies began to unravel. an email he forgot to log out of, a credit card bill with hotel charges, a voicemail she wasn't meant to hear. She didn't keep these as weapons. She kept them as proof she hadn't imagined it. Because the worst part of betrayal isn't the act, it's the gaslighting, the subtle manipulation that makes the victim question their sanity. He never admitted to the affair, but he began treating her like she had changed. "Why are you so cold lately? Why do you always assume the worst?" As if her illness was a character flaw, something that made her undeserving of fidelity. Eventually, she said, he stopped pretending. He no longer came home at night. He took work trips more frequently. And when he did speak, it was with the hollow patience of someone who'd already moved on emotionally, but hadn't bothered to move out physically. Still, she waited, not because she loved him, but because, in her words, "I didn't know where the pain ended, and I began." And then one day, she made a decision. She would leave before he made her feel invisible entirely. She told him during dinner, no fight, no tears, just a single sentence. "I think we're done." He looked up from his plate and said, "If that's what you want." Then continued eating. She moved out within 2 weeks. He didn't call, didn't ask how she was, didn't offer help with the move. And yet, when the world fell in on him, it was her who heard it first. A friend messaged her a month later. "Did you hear what happened to Tom?" Number Natalie had taken nearly everything, bank accounts, electronics, even his passport. He filed a report. But the police couldn't help. Everything had been in both their names. She didn't laugh, didn't gloat. She simply poured herself a cup of tea, sat in silence, and felt the weight she had carried shift ever so slightly off her shoulders. That day she walked to the park alone, breathed in cold air, watched children play in the distance, and for the first time in years she didn't feel like a burden. She had lived through disease, betrayal, and erasure, and still she stood. When she looked at me in the confession room, she wasn't asking for salvation. She was marking something, like a woman finally carving her initials into stone, not to be remembered, but to prove she was ever here. After she left, no one asked where she had gone. There was no parade of phone calls, no letters from her husband's family, not even a message from Tom himself. Just quiet. She said it was the kind of silence that made her question if she had ever existed in their world at all. For weeks she stayed in a small flat above a laundromat. The hum of the machines below became her new clock. In the morning, the spin cycle. At night, the clatter of coins and dryers closing. It was lonely, she said, but it was loneliness, not borrowed from anyone else. The treatments continued. Hospitals, injections, endless blood work. She would come home to a kettle that hadn't been touched, curtains that hadn't been drawn, a bed that remembered exactly how she'd left it. It was during this time that she began writing again. Not poems, not stories, letters. She wrote to her younger self, to the girl who fell in love too quickly, to the woman who thought endurance was a virtue, even in pain, to the patient who had been brave in the face of illness but cowardly in the face of abandonment. She didn't send these letters. She folded them carefully and placed them in a box under her bed, because they weren't for anyone else. They were for the parts of her that had gone unspoken for too long. I remember the way she described the box, not as a place of grief, but of evidence. Evidence that she had not imagined the years, the pain, the heartbreak, proof that she had survived it all. Tom never checked in, not once, not when her white blood cell count dropped to dangerous levels, not when she was hospitalized with a fever that wouldn't break, not even when she came close, so very close, to never waking up again. And yet, life has a strange way of tying loose ends, even when we don't ask for it. Months after her discharge, she ran into someone who knew Tom, a former colleague, casual, not prying, just surprised to see her. He mentioned Tom in passing, said he hadn't been the same since everything went down. She pretended not to understand. The colleague explained. Natalie had vanished, took his savings, left him in a flat with no furniture, even stole his laptop and deleted years of work. Tom had been spiraling, apparently, turned up drunk to a meeting, stopped showing up altogether. Rumor had it he'd moved in with his mother. She didn't flinch when she heard it, didn't soften, didn't harden. She simply said, "People get what they grow." And maybe that was cruel, but maybe it was also the first time she had allowed herself to speak with certainty. After all those years of watching her words, of folding herself into the shape of agreeable, of shrinking when someone else needed space. This was the first time her voice didn't apologize for taking up room. When she told me that, I didn't offer comfort. I offered silence, not the kind that follows pain, the kind that respects it. She had come not to confess, but to be witnessed. And so I witnessed her grief, her endurance, her refusal to vanish. Because sometimes the only way to reclaim what was taken is to speak it into existence, even if only once, even if only to a priest. Some wounds, she told me, don't bleed. They echo. Even after the bruises fade, after the house is left behind and the body begins to recover, there are parts of pain that don't know how to leave with the rest. They linger. In songs that play while you're making tea, in shadows that look like someone you once loved, in dreams that begin warm and end in silence. And for her, healing was never a straight road. It was jagged, messy, and often cruel. After the encounter with Tom's former colleague, she found herself haunted by something unexpected. Not him, but who she had become while loving him. She'd catch herself making 2 cups of tea even though she lived alone. She'd still flinch at the sound of a key in a lock, even though no one else had one. She'd apologize too quickly in conversations, afraid her opinions were inconveniences. It was like Tom had been grafted into her reflexes, a phantom presence. So, she began doing something that terrified her. She used his name, not in curses, not in longing, in stories, in truths. When asked about her past, she stopped saying "my ex." She said Tom. She said, "Tom left me when I got sick." She said, "Tom cheated. I didn't confront him. I left." She said, "Tom broke me in small ways every day, and I let him." Because for so long she had made herself small in his story. Now she was putting herself at the center. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a support group. Cancer survivors. Women who had been abandoned, mistreated, forgotten. She didn't think she had anything new to say. But when she stood up and opened her mouth, the words came rushing. Not like a confession, like a reckoning. She spoke of hospitals, of bruises, of Tom's silences and Natalie's shadow. She spoke of the night she lay in bed, knowing he wouldn't return, and still kept a light on by habit. But most importantly, she spoke of herself, of the woman who left, of the woman who healed, of the woman who now slept with both sides of the bed cold and called it freedom. When she finished, no one clapped. They didn't have to. The tears in the room were enough. Some were hers. That night she walked home differently, straight, taller, as if her spine had grown roots from every syllable she'd spoken aloud. She told me she didn't forgive Tom. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But she forgave herself for staying too long, for being quiet too often, for surviving when everything else fell apart. Then she told me something I will never forget. She said, "There is nothing braver than being abandoned and still choosing not to disappear." Her words weren't proud. They weren't bitter. They were simply true. I asked her what she feared now, if anything, and she paused before answering. Not because she was unsure, but because perhaps for the first time her fears were not about someone else's betrayal. They were about rebuilding. "Sometimes," she said, "I fear I don't know who I am without the pain." And I understood. Because pain gives structure. It becomes routine. It becomes identity. To let go of it is to become a stranger to yourself. So, she started slow. She took pottery classes, adopted a cat, deleted old voicemails, stopped checking her phone for names that wouldn't appear. She bought a second-hand record player and danced to music she used to share with no one. She wore lipstick again, not for anyone, for the mirror. She laughed more, not louder, just more. And it sounded like someone who remembered joy, not discovered it for the first time. I never asked if she loved again. It didn't seem like the point, because some stories aren't about finding someone new. They're about finding yourself where you thought you were lost forever. By the time she finished telling me everything, the tea in the room had gone cold. She stood up, slowly, thanked me, not for advice, not for blessings, but for listening without trying to fix her. Then she reached into her bag and handed me something, a photograph, taken a month ago. She was standing in front of a sunrise on a cliff somewhere north, hair windswept, eyes full, smile soft. She said, "Oike, I wanted you to see what healing looks like, so you don't forget that some stories end quietly but beautifully." And she left. Weeks passed, then months. The woman didn't return to my office immediately. But when she did, she walked in not like a guest, but like someone coming home from a long journey. She wasn't frail, wasn't broken, but she was carrying something, a manila folder, slightly worn at the edges. Inside it, her husband's death certificate. Tom had died of a heart attack, alone in a rented room. His mother had called her, not to reconcile, not to grieve, but because she found her number in an old address book, circled in red. "She thought I should know," she said. I asked what she felt when she heard the news. She said nothing. Then shame for feeling nothing. But that didn't last, because soon came the memories, not of him, but of who she was when she loved him. The girl with hope, the woman with devotion, the silence that held a house together. They all came back. And so she visited the old place, where they once lived, where everything ended. It was smaller than she remembered, dustier, still. But the door creaked in the same way, and the corner of the hallway still had that paint scratch he never fixed. There was no one there now, just echoes. And in that space she did the one thing she never allowed herself. She wept. For the girl who had once dreamed in this room, for the woman who swallowed her words every night, for the man who died without ever saying sorry. Not because she missed him, but because once she had built a life on the idea that he would be worth the waiting, and he hadn't been. The folder with his death certificate stayed on her table for a week. Then she lit a candle, whispered goodbye, and burned it. Because ashes don't lie. They don't pretend. They simply end what should have ended long ago. She looked up at me then and smiled, not because she felt victorious, but because she no longer needed to explain herself. And that is what healing truly is: freedom from the need to be understood. She walked out lighter than she arrived, not healed, but whole. Sometimes the stories that stay with us are not the loud ones, not the ones with betrayal and rage, or death and tears, but the quiet ones, the ones that whisper truths we are afraid to speak aloud, the ones where pain doesn't scream, it just lingers. In this story, a woman lived through betrayal so intimate it almost erased her. She didn't shout. She didn't break things. She didn't seek revenge. She simply left. And then she began the hardest journey of all, not away from someone, but back to herself. This isn't a story about a man who cheated or a woman who suffered. It's about the echo that betrayal leaves behind, about how silence can be louder than shouting, how leaving can sometimes be the most courageous act of love for yourself. So if you're listening to this and you've ever been left behind, or stayed too long, or swallowed your truth to keep someone else's peace, know this: you are not alone. Your pain is not invisible, and your healing does not need to be loud to be real. Because sometimes the bravest confessions aren't shouted in anger. They're whispered in rooms like this one, to people who simply stay and listen.